Hello, everyone. So, my name is Ato Kwesi, and I am chair of the Department of African and African American Studies here at Stanford. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to the 32nd edition of the Clair Drake Lecture, to be delivered by no other than Junot Díaz. This annual lecture was established in 1990 to commemorate the life and work of Clair John Gibbs Drake, his full name, who was the inaugural director of the program in African and African American Studies, which he held from 1969 to 1974. Clair Drake was born in 1911 in Suffolk, Virginia, of a Barbadian father and an African American mother, and died in 1990. These dates bookmark an extraordinary life that was defined by intellectual adventure and scholarly distinction. His first-hand research on African peoples in Africa and in each of the areas of the African diaspora earned him worldwide reputation. These areas included the American South, urban North America, and politics and society in Africa itself. His first book, A Black Metropolis, The Study of Negro Life in a Northern City, was co-authored with the sociologist Horace Clayton and was published in 1945, and is considered to be one of the 20th century's most important studies of Black societies. In 1966, he published Race Relations in a Time of Rapid Change, and followed up with articles in scholarly journals on subjects such as the social and economic status of the Negro in the United States, the Black University in the American social order, and the Black diaspora in an African perspective, among many others. And he also published in non-academic venues, including The Nation, Crisis, Ebony, Africa Today, and the Negro Digest. He earned his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1954 for a dissertation on values, social structure, and race relations in the British Isles. Some of the work for which he did among the Black population in Cardiff, Wales. Cardiff is a port city. I have an interest in port cities, so this made my eyes pop. It was while doing field work in Wales that Clair Drake came to interact with Pan-Africanists such as George Padmore and Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, which, as it happens, I also come from. He subsequently became chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Ghana from 1958 to 1961, and stayed on in Ghana until the military coup of 1966. And while there, he helped shape the identity of the sociology department and the university, and was also a close confidant and advisor of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah during the entire period. As some of you might know, W.E.B. Du Bois is buried in Accra and had been invited by Nkrumah to make a home there when he left the United States for good in 1964. There's a scandal in there somewhere, but we're not going to refer to that. Along with Du Bois, Clair Drake formed the early cohort of African Americans who moved to West Africa to put their shoulders to the wheel of new nation building. In fact, Clair Drake also worked in Liberia before moving to Ghana. These were Pan-Africanists of a kind that are now very rare to find. Sankara Drake's first teaching post was at Roosevelt University in Chicago, where he worked for 23 years, in which period he founded the African Studies program and also was actively involved in establishing the African Studies Association of the United States, which is now 69 years old and thriving. He was persuaded to move to Stanford in 1969, as we noted earlier, to become the first director of the program in African and African American Studies. Drake described himself as an activist anthropologist and used his considerable skills to improve the perception and lives of Black people, starting with his students and moving outwards to embrace various communities in America as well as in Africa. He is what might be considered as an ecumenical humanist and a very wise man. These are words that feature at the entrance of the new offices of the Department of African American Studies here on the board, and which I want to close with. These are the words of Sankara Drake. The role of Black studies is not to impose ideologies, but to expand consciousness and to present alternatives for action. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Paula Moya, and I'm a professor of English here at Stanford University. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Junot Díaz, one of the greatest living American writers, and more importantly, to me at least, my friend. I have been friends with Junot for almost 35 years. We attended graduate school together at Cornell University in the early 1990s when he was an MFA student and I was a PhD student. One of the most amazing things about Cornell in that era is that it offered a vibrant and mind-expanding intellectual culture with students from all over the world. Best of all for me was that PhD students and MFA students socialized and attended class together. It was, moreover, a heady time to be a Latina student at Cornell. Now, of course, we never called ourselves Latina. We called ourselves Latino, Latina, Chicano, Chicana, Mexicano, New Rican, Puerto Rican, but you get the idea. So why were the 1990s such an important time to be a Latino student at Cornell? It was in the fall of 1993 that visiting professor Junot Díaz curated a special exhibit of art, Latino art, that featured the work of Daniel J. Martinez called The Castle is Burning. What Martinez did was to erect a series of tall black walls along the 6 main paths of the Art Squad, right in the middle of campus. These big black walls blocked everyone's view as you walked through the quad. Moreover, they were topped with big block letters with messages such as, "In the rich man's house, the only place to spit is in his face." Now, needless to say, this work of public art was very activating. It was, as Junot has noted, so close, so wild, so fuck you confrontational. I remember being taken aback and feeling kind of vaguely embarrassed, but also wanting to be respectful of the artist's message and his right to be heard. But what I was not expecting was what we got. The major vandalism of the piece, in which the block letters were ripped down and the black walls were defaced with white racist graffiti. I remember in particular Nazi swastikas and the message, "Beaners go home," which honestly hit me really hard. Now, what followed was a 4-day takeover by Latino students and their allies of the president's office at Day Hall, which Junot participated in, and for which I provided material support. The takeover turned out to be very successful. It led directly to the founding of the Latino Living Center, which is still going strong, and a change in the name of the Hispanic American Studies program to the Latino Studies program. But more important was the sense of community that Latino students from a very wide variety of backgrounds forged in the wake of that action. My own friendship with Junot was forged in that crucible, and it is one for which I have been grateful ever since. Now, what I have valued most about Junot over the years is his peerless ability to craft the most beautiful of sentences. In an interview, Toni Morrison described Junot's language as so real and intelligent and wild. She acknowledged it as provocative, but with something so human in the nostalgia and the knowing of human beings. Junot's impressive bilanguaging skills and his range of references, scholarly, pop cultural, and literary, across a wide range of genres, can be, frankly, intimidating. I also admire Junot's fierce activist sensibility. A true race warrior, Junot has never been one to soften his messages about the ravages of neoliberalism and the devastations of white supremacy. One of his most important efforts was his strong condemnation, along with Edwidge Danticat, of the Dominican Republic for their anti-Haitian and, frankly, anti-Black legislation that stripped Haitian migrants and the descendants of Haitian migrants back to 1929 of citizenship in the Dominican Republic. Now, Junot did not emerge from that fray unscathed, but he has retained a great deal of moral clarity about the correctness of his position. Now, one of the pleasures of being a literary critic of the contemporary era is that I get to read and write about the fiction of people like Junot. In my book, The Social Imperative, I read Díaz alongside Black lesbian poet and essayist Audre Lorde to highlight his indebtedness to a feminist tradition of decolonial thinking about identity. Focusing on the short story, How to Date a Brown Girl, Black Girl, White Girl, and Happy, I trace the continuity between Díaz's fiction and the writings of the late 20th century women of color writers to show him as a writer who's thinking in a complex materialist way about the dynamics of racial and gender identity. Now, in a separate analysis of A Short Story Fiesta 1980, which is published elsewhere, I demonstrated how that story features many of the characters, preoccupations, themes, and stylistic techniques that will be familiar to readers of his later fiction. These include the character of Junior, who keeps coming back, the theme of racialized immigration, an acute attention to gender dynamics, a preoccupation with male infidelity, an obsession with reading, a narrative voice that delights in the mixing of linguistic registers, and a distinctive focus on embodiment. Now, embodiment in that particular story shows up in the way characters are rendered as particular and memorable individuals through their hands and what they do with them. So, for example, Papi, the torturer, uses his hands roughly, mostly to dominate and punish his wife and children. He pulls Junior to his feet by his ear to admonish him for having eaten something at a party, getting on the road. He jams his finger into Junior's cheek to punish him after he is thrown up, and he pulls the paper plate roughly out of Junior's hand at the party to keep him from eating. By contrast, Mommy employs her hands primarily in the service of nurturing and comforting her children. She prepares her family's food, crosses each of her children in blessing before they leave the house, and comforts Junior when he needs reassurance. Minor characters are also characterized through what they do with their hands. Tia Irma is illustrated as much by her bead press on nails as by the fact that she hands Junior the 3 pastelitos that she smuggled out of the party for him to eat. Díaz's concern with embodiment goes back to the fact that for the people of the Caribbean, a person's physical features meant the difference between slavery or freedom, privilege or privation, life or death. Beyond the weight of history, Diaz has noted, the body is what reminds us on a daily basis that we're human. The body defies us. It betrays us. We have to struggle with it, and it reveals in curious and abiding ways how we are not perfect. Such a reading is just a small example of the way Diaz represents, at the level of structure, how people's bodies both affect and reveal their capacities to navigate an often unfriended world. So most of you know that Junot was born in the Dominican Republic and raised in New Jersey. Those of you who are readers know that he is the author of the critically acclaimed short story collection, Drown, the amazing novel, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, which won both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award, among other prizes, and another collection of short stories called This Is How You Lose Her. In 2018, Junot also released an illustrated children's book, and I think these are all available from the Stanford bookstore, Island Born, in both Spanish and English. So please join me in welcoming our guest for the St. Clair Drake Lecture, Junot Díaz, to the podium.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paula. The funny part about all those tales is that, we were young little activists trying to do our graduate work. But what Paula fails to mention is she was a single mother of two doing all of this, and that once we got the university to the negotiation table, that Paula was the chief negotiator that wrenched from them all of these achievements, including 6 faculty lines in what was called then Latino Studies, which we'd never had before. And because I was Paula's sort of adjunct in these matters, I was able to see the enormous amount of sacrifice and hard work and genius. So in many ways, anything that Paula says is returned right back, because in fact, those of us who knew Paula then, and I'm sure her colleagues who know her now, spent almost their entire time completely in awe. And played my friendship with Paula and my admiration for Paula, and played no small part in not only my work and my development as a sort of, or my civic sensibility, a good way of putting it, yeah? But anyway, thank you, Paula. And, we would be fortunate to finish school at all with a friend such as you. And I always am grateful to that experience. Again, I wanted to thank, of course, the university for having me, the Department of African and African American Studies for having me, all the folks who made that possible, Sandra, Cindy, the rest of the gang, thank you. The labors are always enormous and invisible. And of course, Atto, Quason, thank you so much. The funniest part is, didn't realize that I'd read a bunch of Atto's essays, and my old brain, erases things. And today, of course, I found all my write-ups about them. So anyway, such is life, right, at this age. And I wanted to thank, of course, all of you who made time for this evening. Also, I have some of my former students from MIT, which I'm sure I was joking around. I'm sure they're shocked to see me out of a fucking hoodie. Yeah. If I can help it, I am like never out of my uniform. Yeah. So anyway, it's good to see you all doing so well. Yeah. So look, I'm doing a bit of a strange thing, sort of a non-creative writing intervention, which for me is unusual. It's about 30 minutes or so. So knock yourself the fuck out, go to sleep, do whatever you can, because this is sort of one of those strange things, that writer Annie Arnaud said, Arnaud, like my French sucks. What's her, pronounce her last name? She got the Nobel Prize, Annie Ernaux. Yeah, you get it. Anyway, she said that funny thing about one of her books. She's like, you know what, I don't know what the hell this is, but I'm going to consider it a cut beneath literature. And I think that's very appropriate because this presentation, this intervention I'm making is a cut below literature, certainly, and a cut below criticism. But we'll see what we can do. All right? I thank you all ahead of time. Yeah? Also, just finally, it's kind of remarkable whenever you hear about the career of sort of your scholarly ancestors, that you realized how much one is living off of the invisible sweat of those who come before you in almost every way possible. What an extraordinary presence has made this conversation possible. Yeah, so I'm really grateful to that. One feels that, yeah? But anyway, so let's get started, yeah? Not much to say, except that this is called Dear Octavia, all right? Dear Octavia, I've been dreaming of you again, Octavia. Probably no surprise. I always find my way to you every time the world turns grim, and the world is beyond grim. Depending on which side of the truncheon you're on, either we are fast approaching parable of the sower territory, one final blaze away from being thrown on a fury road, or parable's apocalyptic ruin is here. Truth is, Octavia, it's hard to know how deep we are into this shit because we're still getting our bells rung on nearly every front every day. We have a president complex that seems hell-bent on breaking the country to pieces, or at the very least dragging communities like ours back to the age of chains, kindred style, and what's happening to immigrants, it's hard to believe. We're being kidnapped by masked thugs, disappeared into detention centers. Dozens of people have died in custody with no consequence at all to those that have facilitated their deaths. If I told you about this back when we last talked, you would have thought it science fiction, maybe even bad science fiction. But it is worse than that. It is us now. This terrifying, bewildering present would dismay you without question, but would have it surprised you? I doubt it. You didn't write the shit you wrote because you thought the arc of the present was bending towards justice. What might shock you about this madness, however, is how little people are fighting back. We are in the middle of a moral, ethical, political collapse on the knife edge of authoritarian overwhelm, and folks seem to be sitting this shit out on some low energy disillusionment type shit. How to explain it? How to explain this entire demented conjuncture, their strength, our weakness, to myself, to my godchildren, to the future, to you? I guess that's why I'm thinking about the last time we saw each other and thinking about that interview that we arranged and never pulled off, and thinking about something that you wrote that troubled the shit out of me and that I plan to talk to you about in our interview. You remember that scene in Dawn where the alien Onkali are preparing to alter Lilith's partner Joseph to violate him biologically, Dike, for his own good. You wrote, the alien stood up, unfolding itself dramatically. When Lilith saw that it was about to leave, she almost relaxed. Then, in a single swift sweep of motion, it stepped to her and looped a sensory arm around her neck, forming an oddly comfortable noose. I circled those two words like 5 times in my original copy of Dawn. Comfortable noose. For some people, words to pass on. For some of us in the diaspora, or maybe just for me, I don't think I ever read a more disturbing pair of words in my damn life. A 2-word apocalypse, a 2-word horror story of the blackest kind. Comfortable noose. Look, Octavia, on one level I get it. Those 2 words perfectly capture the impossible plight of the human survivors that they face at dawn. And more broadly, this racial paradox, as Justin Mann argues, simultaneously encompasses the pleasure and pain, history and futurity, abjection and subjection that constructs late 20th century Black life. So yeah, on one level, I get it, but on another level, I don't get it at all. And each time I read Dawn, 1 year at minimum because I teach it without fail, those 2 words always back me the fuck up. Comfortable noose. 2 words amidst the hundreds of thousands you wrote, and 2 words that stayed on me, wrapped around me, not comfortable at all. What I never got to tell you, Octavia, the very first question I intended to ask you in our interview was precisely about those 2 words. Tell me, if you can, what inspired the comfortable noose. But the interview didn't happen, and I was never able to ask you because you passed before we could meet again. And that was that. Life did its thing, as it always does, but that phrase continued to mess with me, to haunt me, something I couldn't entirely metabolize, or, to quote Morrison, that I couldn't pass on. And then we entered these dreading days, parable days, and I found myself turning ineluctably to you, Octavia. It's been 20 years and 2 months since you passed, and yet you are still the most piercingly revelatory source code for understanding and surviving darkly burning worlds as darkly burning people. If, as Donna Haraway argues in How Like a Leaf, science fiction is political theory, yours, Octavia, is the political theory that resonates most generatively across my racial frequencies. And so amidst all this carnage, the democracy's eroding everywhere, the anti-blackness, the anti-immigrant xenophobia, amidst the full-on, rampant destruction of civil rights, I turn to you, Octavia. And what I've come to realize is that if this stage of our ongoing settler colonial apocalypse has a structuring logic, a dark energy that brings it all together, and in the darkness binds it, it may be the very 2 words that unsettled me for decades, comfortable noose. And that your unnerving vision of black bodies falling into annihilating complacency with the very structures organized to destroy us is exactly the kind of prophetic political theory that we need. Normally, when I encounter something like the comfortable noose in the work of a writer I love, my first impulse is to write something back in the form of fiction. Like you, Octavia, fiction is how I best work through what troubles me, where I am most able to approach what you did best, what George Orwell calls the power of facing unpleasant facts. Fiction would be ideal for this baffling twilight of ours, for working through the comfortable noose, but then you'd have to wait a decade or 2 or 3 for me to write the damn thing, and that's simply not practical. The hour is growing late in every sense of the word. What I can do here as a down payment for a novel is share with you where your comfortable noose has taken me, what comfortable nooses your comfortable noose apocalypse has revealed. Now, another writer might pick different nooses to focus on. Someone smarter might begin with neoliberal capitalism or racial neoliberalism, but as you well know, Octavia, the work is rarely reasonable. You have to go with what calls you. I trace these particular comfortable nooses here not to be comprehensive, but hopefully to be useful to identify and perhaps even to unpick. So let's begin unpicking. Comfortable noose 1. Sadopopulism. If I have to start large, then I'm starting with sadopopulism. This comfortable noose was not visible in your time, I don't think, Octavia, but it's something that's gripped us hard these last decades and helped unleash Trump and all of his malignancies. The historian Timothy Snyder, who coined the concept, defines sadopopulism thusly: as opposed to traditional populism that offers some redistribution, something to the people from the state, sadopopulism assumes no mobility or redistribution is possible and salves the pain of this immobility by only offering the spectacle of others being still more deprived. Sadopopulist politicians spread the conviction that the present state of affairs is eternal and that government cannot aid society as a whole, but can only guard against threats. Rather than discuss reforms, this is all quotes now, these politicians designate threats. Rather than presenting a future with possibilities and hopes, they offer an eternal present with defined enemies and artificial crisis. For this to work, of course, citizens have to meet these politicians halfway. Demoralized by their inability to change their station in life, they must accept that the meaning of politics lies not in institutional reform, but in daily emotion. They must stop thinking about a better future for themselves, their friends, and their families, and prefer the constant invocation of a proud past and the suffering of those that they are told are their enemies. Instead of choosing a leader who will improve their lot, the sadopopulist electorate indulges in the fantasy that they have chosen who administers their pain and can fantasize that this leader will hurt their enemies more. The sadopopulists themselves are clearly hurting, but the politics of eternity that these leaders insist upon, that nothing can change for the better and all there is this forever war with our enemies, converts pain to meaning and then meaning back into more pain. This cruel Ouroboros forms the core of sadopopulism. When poor and marginalized folks who are getting made poorer and more marginalized celebrate the disenfranchisement of queer and trans folks, this is sadopopulism. When African Americans and Latinas and Asian Americans whose rights are being abridged cheer Trump's anti-immigrant pogroms, this is sadopopulism. When Republican states that are being gutted celebrate the person gutting them because at least he's gutting Democrats more, this is sadopopulism. The sadopopulist, in other words, is so excited that they get to pull someone else's noose, they don't notice that the rope that they're holding is connected to a comfortable noose around their neck. You cannot imagine how ubiquitous this shit and how quickly naturalized it has become across the political spectrum, Octavia. That so many people have allowed themselves to grow comfortable with this sadopopulist Ouroboros. What is an Ouroboros if not a noose? Including many people of African descent, this always sends me right back to you. Comfortable noose 2, the anti-solidaritist imaginary. The next one will depress the shit out of you, Octavia, who believed so much and so deeply and wrote about so well the frustrating, difficult, salvific necessity of collectivities. The world didn't listen to you, Octavia. It listened to the billionaires and their systems instead. And if you thought folks were individualistic in your time, prepárate. Our age has dialed up capital's hatred of collectivities to 1,000. As Henry Thoreau laments, our society suffers from a pathological disdain for community, public values, and the public good. A counter-earth seed has sunk its rot into every strata, every corner, every political fraction in this country, driven by a single implacable imperative: suffer not the collective to live. I am not kidding, Octavia. Suffer not the collective to live is now the ideological law of the fucking land. a prime directive that has engineered neoliberal subjects who are more partisan, more divided, more alone, more vulnerable to disinformation and depoliticized thinking and self-harming reactivity than ever before. We are surrounded by entire populations who are being devoured by our vampire squid overlords, and yet rather than looking for any excuse to form a united front against these monsters, bend over backwards to find any and every excuse not to join with others in a common cause, not to form collectives. What would strike you mad for certain is how many folks who should know better, folks who are only around because they were saved by collectives, tragically embrace the anti-solidaritist imperative, having perhaps decided that the hard, slow, humble, frustrating work of connecting across difference is now a burden too great to bear, and that imperfect allies are more threatening to their well-being than esclavitud perpetua, and perhaps more chillingly obeying the politics of eternity that insists that conversations of any kind with political enemies are useless because nothing can ever change. The deepest irony, of course, is that some of the people whose well-being is too fragile for the rigors of solidarity often betray boundless constitution when it comes to promoting anti-solidaritist imagination across class, across race, across everything. When it comes to fighting hegemonic foes like Trump straight on, the anti-solidaritist folks cannot be found. Symbolic soldiers at best. Read my tweet, buy my book. But when there's a chance to stick a knife in another lesser target in a way that allows them to appear to be fighting hegemony, when in fact they're simply prosecuting the anti-solidaritist imperative that strengthens hegemony, there is always time for that. When I reflect on comfortable nooses, anti-solidarity is one that folks seem the most eager to wrap themselves in from head to toe. What's bananas, in a deadly sort of way, is that the people who are most anti-solidaritist in practice, especially on our side of the political equation, are often the ones who believe they're the most solidaritist of all. This is a classic example of Mark Fisher's point in Capital Realism of how neoliberalism encourages people to overvalue belief in the sense of the inner subjective attitude at expense of the belief we exhibit and externalize in our behavior. Which is to say, as long as I believe I'm solidaritist, I am free to continue to participate in capitalist anti-solidaritist imperative. This neoliberal habit of overvaluing belief to the benefit of hegemons is another comfortable noose all its own, but which I don't have time to describe right now. In your novels, Octavia, you never shied away from how demoralizing it is to pursue a solidaritist imagination, but how utterly necessary this imaginary was for survival in a burning world. It is precisely this solidarity mind that saves Lilith and the future humanity in Dawn, that keeps Adyanwu in Wild Seed from falling into Doro's trap, and why Lauren in the parable novels was able to imagine Earthseed and bring people together to pursue it. What your work shows, Octavia, and what the comfortable noose of anti-solidarity wishes all of us to unknow is that freedom is a collective state. Collectives are not here to make us feel happy or comfortable. Collectives are here to make us free. Comfortable noose 3, sub-elite capture. Here's even worse news, Octavia. We have made you impossible. Well, maybe not impossible, but highly improbable. You came up a poor black woman who never got an MFA and still, with great difficulty, became a world-making writer. Well, sadly, the chances of a poor person of African descent, much less a poor woman of African descent, becoming an artist of any kind have plummeted precipitously. There ain't a ton of research in this area, but what we got sucks. In 2022, the UK Office of National Statistics found that 16.4% 16% of creative workers born between the years of 1953 and 1962, 16%, had working class backgrounds. But 4 decades later, that number stands at 7.9. Translation: over 50% less working class artists in the UK. Now, imagine what those numbers look like for poor people, for poor black people, for poor black women in the United States, where the arts are nowhere near as supported as in the UK. But that's not the noose that's got me. The noose that's got me is subtler, more perverse, more within the community than without. You see, Octavia, these days, when you encounter poor folk of African descent in the arts or in any elite spaces, whether it be college, electoral politics, activism, chances are these poor belong to a category that sociologist Anthony Jack calls the privileged poor. Poor students who have the social capital to access programs that place them in private high schools, which in turn helps them to enroll in select colleges where they prosper at rates higher than the non-privileged poor. Poor who Anthony calls the doubly disadvantaged. While Jack's work focuses exclusively on select college, these concepts, privileged, poor, and doubly disadvantaged, are useful for describing those poor that have the social and cultural capital to more easily access and operate in elite spaces than those poor who do not. The privileged poor currently make up more than half the population of poor students in colleges and select colleges, and their share of the pie is increasing rapidly. Now imagine what those numbers would look like in activist spaces, in art spaces, in writing spaces. After all, given how university graduates have come to dominate all elite spaces in general, whether we're talking about arts, academia, environment, politics, I don't think it's a huge stretch to imagine that the privileged poor outnumber the regular poor in these areas as well, perhaps to an even greater degree since most elite spaces lack the robust affirmative action infrastructures that often help to level the playing field at the university level historically. This rise of the privileged poor over the regular poor, I argue, is a form of elite capture. Perhaps a lesser, subtler kind of elite capture than most folks are used to, a sub-elite capture, if you will, that nevertheless reduces the presence of the doubly disenfranchised poor within elite spaces. A sub-elite capture that reduces the chances of you, Octavia. And that's a problem for all of us on every front, because it ain't just the numbers. After all, it stands to reason that the privileged poor's fluency in the codes of privilege, their familiarity with privileged communities, would make them more hegemonically legible than the doubly disadvantaged, granting the privileged poor an epistemic advantage, especially when speaking on matters of poverty, of race, of inequality. Which is to say that the privileged poor are more likely to be accorded authority by the society at large to set the terms of any debate around race, inequality, poverty. In other words, even when there is no numerical advantage between the two sets of poor, the privileged poor's voice and opinions will likely count more. That the privileged poor might use this authorized advantage to shape and dominate discussions around poverty, around race, around inequalities in ways that are more amenable to hegemony is something that I've experienced firsthand as both a doubly disadvantaged person while I was in college and later as a privileged poor when I was in grad school. After all, as Olufume O Taiwo has pointed out, elite capture doesn't only describe the way this socially disadvantaged people tend to gain controls over benefits and resources meant for others. Elite capture is also about how knowledge, attention, and values get distorted and distributed by our power structures. I'm going to engage in some Hartman-esque critical fabulation and argue that by doubly silencing doubly disadvantaged folks, the comfortable noose of sub-elite capture has deleteriously impacted our ability to fight back against our hegemons, to fight, period. By marginalizing the counter-hegemonic archives of resistance, the practical genius, the longitudinal courage, and the orthogonal futures that the poorest of the poor carry and embody, we have robbed ourselves of our greatest weapons against our hegemons. Which is why, no matter how poor we think we are, we must attend to the poorer still. This is something you dramatize again and again in your work, Octavia, and nowhere more aptly than in Kindred, where Dana risks her own life to teach the enslaved children Nigel and Carrie to read. Carrie, who pointedly is mute. Without insights like these, like yours, Octavia, we'd literally be on the training floor without Lilith, and we would be fucking screwed, and not just in the short term, but forever. That there's an entire subset of the African diaspora that is comfortable with and even abets the marginalization of bodies and voices like yours, Octavia, feels to me like one of the most tragic nooses of all, and makes me wonder how many of you we have lost to this comfortable noose, Octavia. How many? Sado-populism, anti-solidarity, sub-elite capture. 3 comfortable nooses. Not the worst, not the cruelest, just the ones whose shadows are on me, the ones I cannot pass on. There's others that I could trace, of course. For example, how the hermeneutics of suspicion and, Maldonado Torres' term, ego conquiro, and the logics of mass incarceration were reforged in the negative fires of social media into a 4th historical ego after ego cogito, ego conquiro, and ego extermino, ego persucor, I prosecute, therefore I am. But the hour is late and your work is calling me, refusing as always to let the nooses have the final word. That is not the Butlerian way. You love to throw us the bleakest at us, to draw from our apocalyptic past the materials for your apocalyptic futures, and yet no matter how grim you prophesized or the infinite agonies that you plumbed, you never failed to offer tools to help us sustain ourselves, tools with edges sharp enough to cut a noose with. First is the ethos strategy you advocate in all your work that I call blasphemous solidarity. Almost done. Blasphemous solidarities describes the capacity to connect with people outside of our networks with whom we have every reason not to ally with. Lilith's attempt to work with the racists on the training floor in Dawn, this is blasphemous solidarity. When Anyan Wu tries again and again in Wild Seed to create common cause with Doro, this is blasphemous solidarity. Lauren's gifts for pulling together disparate people from across class, race, and political beliefs, this is blasphemous solidarities. When Dana in Kindred saves her cruel white slave owner ancestor repeatedly, this is blasphemous solidarity. I call these radical solidarities blasphemous because in an age like ours, where folks are more partisan, more divided, more stuck in their networks than ever before, where the various sides often view each other as irredeemable and evil, the suggesting of forming coalitions with the so-called enemy will strike many as straight up treason, as well, blasphemy. Whether one views solidarity across painful difference as worse, as blasphemy, depends whether one views solidarity across painful differences as worse than total destruction. What these decades have taught us is we can never overcome the forces that afflict us, never survive the nightmare future our neoliberal systems have teed up for us, unless we learn to accomplish big things with and for people we don't know or necessarily like, unless we build family with people who are not family, unless we call beloved what is not beloved. We will need to betray the mandates of our sides, step outside of our network, practice a hopped-up version of Delaney's contact, and learn to thrive in, or at least endure, blasphemous solidarities. But it's not just blasphemous solidarities that your political theory insists on, Octavia. Your work also offers a vitally different way of thinking about radicality and radical commitment, one that takes after philosopher Daniel Ben Said and is more focused on strategy and tenacity than on negative resistance. A practical radicality that emphasizes watchfulness, endurance, and perseverance, and that is characterized by what Ben Said called impatient patience in the face of deep historical injustice. Quote, such a patience is impatient in the sense that it locates the moment of justice in the here and now, in contrast to the dream of some coming revolution. Yet the impatient patience at the heart of Ben Said's political theory is still more patient, precisely in the sense that it enjoins us never to give up the work for justice, no matter what the odds. Like Ben Said, your prophetic political theory, Octavia, insists that radicality means learning the necessary revolutionary slowness, the courage of every day, and the will of each day, which are again a restrained and dominated impatience. We see the courage of every day in Lilith, who fights not for victory today, but for the future victory that she will never enjoy. As Lilith declares, if she were lost, others didn't have to be. Humanity didn't have to be. Lilith never gives up the work for justice, no matter what the odds. And finally, if there is ever a finally between us and your work, Octavia, there is your prophetic vision of the past that honors Glissant's call to a return to the point of entanglement, to those plantations past, present, and future that haunt all your fiction, and engages with our traumatic history, not to foreclose possibilities, but in order to create new, unpredictable futures. In its refusal to pronounce final judgment or to contain what is indeterminate about the past, present, or future, your prophetic vision of the past, Octavia, obliterates the politics of eternity, whether these dead horizons be Sado-populist or Afro-pessimist, and offers an approach to ancestrality that is radical in its refusal to recruit alibis as proxy for a judgment, to recruit ancestors as alibi or proxy for a judgment of and against the modern. Ancestors in your work in the roads of Rosalind Morris are not paragons of virtue. They are people who are as flawed as their heirs, who, like Morrison's ancestral presences in Beloved, are multitudinous, cacophonous, premature, and terminated. Beings in whom the transcendental dimension of the social is made manifest. Beings that cannot be assigned to the past. Ancestors orient action in the present on the horizon of futurity. You knew the truth about our ancestors, Octavia. You knew that our ancestors are not trapped in the past. They await us always in the future, the way you, my literary ancestor, are always awaiting me in the future. Those of us who grew up in societies where ancestors are real know a simple truth as well. Communicating with ancestors is a form of translation, and translation always incurs costs and sacrifices. German theologian and philosopher Friedrich Schleiermacher described two translation strategies that are germane to our discussion of your ancestral science, Octavia. Either the translator leaves the author undisturbed as possible and moves the reader to them, or the translator leaves the reader as undisturbed as possible and moves the author to the reader. One method demands sacrifice from the ancestor. The other demands sacrifice from those of us who call on the ancestor. Your books are clear on which method is the only method that can ever hope to work. It is blasphemous solidarities wedded to an impatient, patient radicality and a prophetic vision of the past that wins the day in all of your novels, Octavia, and that might just free our throats from some of these nooses. But before I go, Octavia, a question. Did you ever read Watership Down? I have scoured the archives and cannot find any confirmation. In Watership Down, our rabbit heroes, who are super coded as Brer Rabbit types, right? And this is like, talk about inferential ethnicity. They're like black rabbits, yeah. Take shelter, our hero rabbits take shelter with another group of strange rabbits who are well-fed but curiously inert. Strange rabbits who tell no trickster ancestral stories and make bizarre pieces of art, all very un-rabbit-like. Turns out these rabbits have accepted a macabre bargain. They grow fat and healthy on the vegetables the nearby farmer puts out, and in turn are occasionally snared by the farmer for his pot. I wanted to ask you this question because this strikes me as exactly the type of shit you were trying to warn us about with the comfortable noose. These rabbits have abandoned their opacity, their fugitivity, their ancestors, and their technology. Rather than to face the dangers of the larger world, they have accepted the comfortable noose by another name. As you remind us all in your work, Octavia, the comfortable noose is always near. And if we hope to elude it, to survive it as a people until a future arrives worthy of us, we must learn to sacrifice our odd comforts, and we must heed Lilith's call in dawn to learn and run. Learn and run. There's always more to say, Octavia, but I have to save the rest for another letter. I know you know Spanish, so I'll end this with buena noche, Octavia, te extraño mucho, me salvaste y sigues salvándome. Yours in darkness. Thank you. Over here.
So, good evening. I'm Jose Saldivar, and I'm in the Department of Comparative Literature, and I'm delighted to serve as a moderator for the Q&A. Thank you, Jose. So let me just, I have only a couple of them. So it's a wrote in Junot's honor. Before we get to the Michigan, and I had a question, but Paula stole it. I wanted to talk about Toni Morrison, but I just heard that great minds think alike. So I did pass that up. But a book, a short story, a cuento, a memorial lecture, like this one by Junot Díaz, tends to be an historical event. That is a narrative constructed rather than discovered, using literary tropes, using the literature of cognitive estrangement, right, which gives us sci-fi. I would love that definition of science fiction, of cognitive estrangement, of delineation. This is a part of a writer like Junot Díaz. Using literary tropes and modes of employment. In this case, it was a letter. I mean, that kind of threw me through a curve. Epistolary kind of. This one? Use on I take near? Great.
I write her a letter every year.
That's great.
So,
I'd love to read it.
no, you won't.
So, a mode of employment, a letter, a tragedy, a social death, or a flourishing. So Díaz's St. Clair Memorial Lecture, that was titled Dear Octavia, Notes from the Book of the Dead, is an event not only in African American studies, but also literary studies. impinging on the Americas and globality, what Junot famously called the Fuku Americanus. Now, what that kind of species genus idea is? Remind me a little bit of Foucault saying, well, I do archaeology and I do genealogy. The same kind of mood that I see in the Fuku Americanus in the brief one verse 5 of Oscar now. As Professors Quaison and Moya noted earlier, Junot's books, his cuentos, or short stories, his lectures have an impact, they carry a touch, and they provoke wondrous debate. That was my layout.
Thank you.
And I want to get to our Q&A, and I wanted to thank Maddie Anderson of Sociology and Antonio Lopez of Modern Cloth Literature for helping me gather the cards and the questions. So, I mean, I just, when we were talking, I think I asked you maybe 10 years ago for a copy of your source, which of course I, reload and restructured, because I too teach at Talbot Butler's Dawn and the Ethnogenesis trilogy every year in my freshman seminar, right? And what I love about the title of the book, the way it's dawn, swerves between, on the one hand, the Junot pointed out, xenophobia, but it also swerves to xenophilia, and how we grapple with the other or with aliens, and yet we have to learn and run constantly through the world. So I'll ask my question. Paula already got that. And I've been dying to get your opinion because I used this quotation from Toni Morrison in her discussion with Junot at the NIA Public Library. And as Paula read part of it, she said, this is what Toni Morrison said about Junot's writing. I believe I read your short stories first. What attracted me to those stories, or whatever I read, I have a short-term memory loss. You have to understand, I'm 86. So I get to forget things. Was how startled I was by the language. So Toni Morrison not only was one of our best novelists ever, she was one of our best readers. As we know, did her master's at Yale, wrote on Virginia Woolf at Faulkner, wrote 2 books of criticism. I one time had the pleasure of hosting her when I was at Duke. And I was super nervous talking with Toni Morrison. She said, Jose, I'll call you Professor Saltiva if you call me Professor. The way I'll call you Professor Díaz if you call me Professor Saltiva. She says, it was so real and intelligent and wild. There was a wildness as well as some deep intelligence. And I didn't think the combination of the two was possible in recent literature. Yours struck quite immediately, and it wasn't just the combination of words from Santo Domingo or curse words. I mean, Junot loves to drop, yeah. Said what? Or grammatical uniqueness. It was provocative, but there was something so human in the nostalgia. And that phrase really made me super interested. And that's what I'll ask Junot about. Is what is this in the nostalgia? There was something so human in the nostalgia. I mean, don't add to the fact of being human.
Sure. I mean, look.
So I got a hard question.
No, not at all. I'm going to dodge.
It's just so curious about what
I'm
is
going to
Morrison
dodge.
getting at.
I'm going to dodge, not because I'm not going to comment on what Toni Morrison has to say about anything. So not just out of some kind of over respect. That just, look, I think for writers, thinking and talking about other writers, it's never the easiest thing, because truly what you're thinking about other writers is emerging more, I think, more intriguingly in how you're writing with whatever you've acquired or that has struck you that. And again, I don't know, I think that, I find it difficult to really think about that.
Right. I mean, I think one could write a whole book just of that. These about language, about his uniqueness, about being wild and provocative. I mean, she said she doesn't see it anymore. She's 86. She doesn't see it anymore in what we could call post-contemporary American. Maybe somebody will write that. I'll bet you that's aggressive.
I'm ready for that.
How can we bring class back into the material conversation?
Yeah, national.
Natural?
National.
National. Okay, great.
Yeah, I mean, right? I mean, I look, I know this is the case, but we have such ridiculously great just corpus of people who are writing in intriguing ways about class. I always think that Samuel Delaney's comments on the novel, right? That the novel is all about, for him, fundamentally, the conflict in class. It's like, that's why the novel is the novel, how it's organized, many of its roots, that at one level or the other, it's about these strange sort of back and forth. So that the novel, in Delaney's concept, invites these kinds of narratives. And of course, there was a time where writing about class was, I think, a lot less Netflix absurd than it is now. Part of the problem, of course, is that I think that I could be wrong as usual, but I think part of the problem, what I've seen working is an editor reading like manuscripts nonstop, is that ultimately the orientation has shifted in a very intriguing way that helps to defang conversations about class. So many writers from marginalized communities have become fucking absolute experts at pointing the fingers at other people. Absolute experts. It's like, why? But they never point the finger at other people through themselves. And until you get that back, right, where the issue was that there was a time before social media rewrote the way we think about everything, I think class is going to be very, very difficult to see, because really class is much more interesting from a literary perspective when the person is blowing up their own class versus doing the Bridgerton thing where this is the social media fantasy, right? That we always got shit to say about everybody else's class as a way to avoid a real criticism about how we're availing ourselves of endless privilege, no matter what class we're in. And again, I can up as a little England. My mom didn't have shit. I'll tell you what. My mom was raising 5 kids by herself in an unelectrified shack. I'll tell you what. My mom had a girl who came in and helped her cook. So I can sit all day and be like, oh shit, we're so poor, but I'm like, hell's got many levels and there's always one to be new. So I think that's, for me, what would be much more interesting. And I was talking to a bunch of grad students, really brilliant people, and I just kept thinking about that. I do contests all the time where I would judge like 100 novels, first novels by people. And I don't want to sound like a super dick, but again, if I find one novel where I don't immediately know whose side the writer is on, I'm amazed. Because it's become so obvious, writers are no longer creating these literary objects where you're completely confused where the solidarity, where the judgment, where our sympathies are supposed to go. You're like, oh shit, and that's Morrison. You read Morrison. You can't tell me whose side Morrison is on. That's real tough. And I'm always looking for that. And so I think a lot of this shifts in the way we think about things. And these are like not insignificant in the fact that they show up. I still remember we had a meeting for a book judge, and we said, hey, why don't we only pick books where we can immediately tell what side the writer's on? And after a week, my fellow judges were like, this is fucked up. Like, is so obvious, it's so tendentious.
Next question. Yes, here we go. Juno, do you have any tangible advice for a young person attending a school like Stanford or MIT to escape the comfortable place?
Yeah.
You've been writing a YA novel first. I hope that you can read it as it's being written in some Substack. In this day and age, how do you see publishing changing?
Wow, that's a life. Yeah, okay.
Good question.
I mean, I don't know, because the new conditions of being a student, I'm a fucking professor. I don't know the shit these young people are going through. You know what I mean? You don't even get the rumor of the rumor, what they're going through, and what these new realities are for the students. I have no idea. I could tell whoever asked the question, what helped me? And again, it was like my loving mentor was always telling me, she was South African, and she's like, stop fucking looking uphill. You're always looking uphill at people who are better off than you, who've got more than you. And that's so demoralizing and demotivating. Look downhill. If you look at the people who don't got shit, it makes getting kicked in the teeth way easier because they're being kicked everywhere. And that altered my life. Because the question is always, my mentor kept, John Chick, always saying to me, compared to who? Oh my God, Rutgers is so hard. My professors are so racist. Compared to who? And it's a wonderful question that really helped me. I don't know if I'll have any one of these two issues, but I needed to get my mind out of that and move it toward the sense that the reality is, if you ain't dead, your privilege is endless. We're so busy slicing how we don't have privilege to weaponize it as a protection racket against other people that we spend no time thinking about the other side. Oh, and publishing?
Yeah.
Yo, publishing sucks, right? But it's always sucked. The best thing that someone did for me is that there was, when I was published, 1996, the first time, they had this photograph gallery of everybody who got published that year, and somebody composited what it looks like now. And publishing is younger, richer, more networked than it ever was. You're far more likely to be an Ivy League person or select college person to be published than in my day. And so I think the editors are so overloaded because of the way the publishing's gone from sort of it used to be a very, very kind of, I hate to use this word, but a gentlemanly profession. These rich white dudes owned the house. It wasn't part of global capital. Now all publishing is a part of global capital. Editors have to return double-digit profits, not the single-digit profits that characterized publishing in my time. Editors no longer have the time to read. They're assigned 80, 90 projects versus when my editor first started, who had a ton of time to read, to work with me. So they've had to farm out a lot of shit, which means that they farmed out who they're publishing to elite schools because they don't got time to vet. So they're like, MFA, Harvard, you're 18, you look cute, go. And I think that it's showing up repeatedly. And of course, you know, that the critic Stanley Cavell says reducing it a bit, only the normal has the power to move the norm. And I think it's no accident that all this elite literature is not having much receptivity beyond the fact that reading is hard anyway. So if you got a select college, you're fucking good.
Well, I have marching orders from Otto Grayson to keep this at 20 minutes. So we're running out of time. So, but I'll ask maybe one or two.
Yeah.
So books of the dead are always written for the living. Gogol, dead soul. James Joyce, the dead. Even Orlando Patterson, social death. What makes Octavia's Butler's different from that trope of the dead servant?
Yeah.
Dead, I just because I was right up my alley.
Yeah.
I thought of, Leslie Solko's Almanac of the Dead.
Yeah.
800-page book.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think of this, it depends on, not to be like too absurd, but I guess it depends on like, what your ontological definitions. Because I think that if you're of African descent, you don't need Patterson to tell you that you're 1 foot dead. Now, I'm not into the whole, I really admire it, and there's some of it that I like. I'm not into the whole kind of politics of eternity of Afro-pessimism, and this so like foreclosing the sort of ancestral indeterminacy of who we are and what we are, nor am I interested in conscripting the slave to come and labor in the present to make political arguments. But I do think that there is an important part of being a member of the African diaspora which has to deal with that social debt. Not that it overdetermines everything of our horizon, but that therefore those of us who believe and engage in this, we're not just writing to the dead because we're writing to our future selves, we're also dealing with that very strange paradox of what it means to be socially dead and yet completely alive in certain ways. And that's an interesting thing. Not everybody writes with that sensibility. And I think Octavia was very clear about that sensibility. I think she was very, very clear.
So, since I have my brother in the audience, he's always one of the first to, I'll give him the last question. That's my question. He's not one for question. Of course, I should have about the debt. Oh.
Somehow I knew it too, Ramon.
So you already asked him? So I have one more time for one more question. Who's going to ask a question for Junot? If not, we'll call it a wonderful.
Here we go. We've got one.
Get one there.
How do we, as the privileged poor or other marginalized communities who are broken into higher education, bring our experiences to higher places or planes while reserving room for the doubly marginalized in us? I mean, it's a wonderful question. I think so many people are doing it. I think that it is hard to, one of the things I love about Octavia Butler's work, right, is that she's got all of these sort of transhuman figures, right? And so she's got these DLG sufferers, these people who are suffering from this illness that gets inflicted on them because somebody like pharmaceutical stuff, a parent, etc. But these folks have to constantly scan themselves. They constantly have to put themselves into a certain kind of bearing witness to make sure that they're not falling for the illness. And I think it's so difficult, this reality we're in, to constantly negotiate and renegotiate our privilege. But what else do we got? And so many people are doing it. Every time I meet my students at MIT, all of them are doing this great volunteer work. All of them are doing what Dana does in Kindred. She's like, I can read and write. I can't break the slingocracy. Well, I can move orthogonally and try to teach someone else to read and write. And I think so many people are doing it. I think to keep doing it, to keep alive the scan that at any given moment, all of us can succumb to the recuperative powers of capital is perhaps the most important struggle that we all face every day. I mean, fortunately, if you're doing intellectual work or if you got your students, that helps a lot. But it's tough to do this stuff, but I think so many young people are doing it. In a place like this, a lot of people are doing it. And that's what gives me the most hope. Just to use that hermeneutics of suspicion, not in the way that this civilization asks you, but to be a little bit suspicious about your own comfort with privilege every single day versus how suspicious we are about everybody else's fucking privilege. If you were honest with yourself and said to yourself, how much energy do you spend wrestling with other people's privilege? Just truthfully, looking at people saying, oh, they don't take me seriously, or it's hard in this class, or it's difficult to be this kind of writer, or it's this. If you just think about how much time you spend on that and how little time you spend on what that girl who was washing dishes for my mother back in San Domingo was thinking about me, I think that would be an extraordinarily different way of thinking about ourselves in the world. That I actually think it would be more just, I hate to use this word, I think it'd be more relaxing, more human, more integrative, less lonely. Anyway, thank you everyone, and thank you, Jose David.